On behalf of Namita Gokhale, William Dalrymple, and all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts, welcome back to JLF's Brave New World. Our magazine partner for this series is The Week, Journalism with a Human Touch. Our first session of the day is Heart of the Matter on Geopolitics, a selection of perspectives on the complicated dynamics in geopolitics in the current world order, specially curated from across our many insightful GLF Brave New World discussions. This episode will feature a host of brilliant speakers, including former Indian ambassador to China, Gautam Bambable, Suhasini Haidar, diplomatic affairs editor of The Hindu, Sanjeev Sanyal, economist, urban theorist, and historian, journalist Vikram Chandra, senior fellow at the Observer Research Foundation, Mihir Sharma, and Pulitzer Prize winner and staff writer at The Atlantic, Anne Applebaum. Gautam Bambable was a member of the Indian Foreign Service from 1984 to 2018. He was India's ambassador to Bhutan, Pakistan, and China. Suhasini Haidar is the diplomatic and national editor at The Hindu. She writes regularly on India's foreign policy and has contributed to several books in the subject. Sanjeev Sanyal is an internationally acclaimed economist and best-selling author. He's also currently the principal economic advisor to the Government of India and serves as the co-chair of the G20 Framework Working Group. Vikram Chandra is the founder of Editor G Technologies, a startup that seeks to transform video news through innovation and in-user experience using artificial intelligence. Chandra was one of India's best-known TV news anchors, presenting The Big Fight, 9 o'clock news, Gadget Guru, Cleanathon, Greenathon, and Save Our Tigers. Anne Applebaum is a staff writer for The Atlantic and a senior fellow at the Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University, where she runs a project on 21st century disinformation. She's also the author of several books, including Red Famine, Stalin's War on Ukraine, Iron Curtain, The Crushing of Eastern Europe, 1944 to 1956, and Gulag, a history, which won her the 2004 Pulitzer Prize for Nonfiction. Mihir Sharma is Senior Fellow at the Observer Research Foundation and head of its Economy and Growth Program. In 2019, he co-edited What the Economy Needs Now with Nobel laureate Abhijit V. Banerjee and also with Geeta Gopinath and Raghuraman Rajan. As you are all aware, all our sessions are available to view on our Facebook page, JLF Litfest, and on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. Please do remember to comment by typing it into the comment section below. And in case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, you can find us on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. And of course, remember, if we drop off, just hang in there and we'll be right back. Do stay logged in till the end of this episode, where we have a very special feature, a film to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Pierre Gautam, Eden, Eden, Eden. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me as we welcome Heart of the Matter on Geopolitics.
Today, and I say this with emphasis because just yesterday the Ministry of External Affairs finally came out and made it clear that in fact Chinese troops have been amassing along the LAC since early May. So we're looking at a standoff that is nearly 2 months, or at least nearly 2 months in age. And I say this without trying to be dramatic because, you know, with India-China relations, one wants to not be dramatic, but we are in uncharted territory. 45 years since the last casualties of this kind at the LAC between Indian and Chinese troops. A situation where I might say every agreement, every protocol, particularly the 1993 protocol that had decided how Indian and Chinese troops would be able to maintain peace and tranquility as it was known on the line of actual control. All of that, that's 27 years old, all of that has been cast aside. And yet we see the two sides still talking. We see the external affairs minister take part in talks along with Russia, and the Chinese foreign minister discuss other issues. We are here, diplomatic parleys are happening. Military commanders are meeting and discussing disengagement. So my first question to you would really be, are we looking right now at the beginning of the end of this standoff, or is this really just the end of the beginning?
That's a very interesting and an excellent question, Suhasini. And I don't know if anyone in India, at least, and possibly no one in China either, has an answer to that question. But you are not wrong in your opening remarks, in your initial remarks. You did mention that one of the things which is different on the LAC this time is the fact that there are huge numbers of troops massed on both sides. And this is different from the past when stray patrols of maybe 30, 40 soldiers would come across each other and would be in close proximity to each other. And therefore, obviously, the conclusion that many in India have drawn, and which is absolutely correct, is that this is not something accidental. It is something which has been planned, is premeditated, and there's absolutely no doubt about that. The question that all of us are asking is, why are the Chinese doing this? What are their motivations? And I would say that what they're trying to do on the ground is to move their actual ground positions where their troops are right up till their idea, their conception of what the LAC is. And therefore, they realized that where India-China relations are concerned, where this whole architecture of peace and tranquility is concerned, which, as you rightly said, has been built up from the 1993 agreement and many agreements thereafter, uh, that one of the crucial and critical things there is not to change the status quo on the ground. This time round, the Chinese have changed the status quo on the ground, and therefore I would say that they're responsible for everything that's happening since then. Also, yes, both sides are talking, and I would say that this is one of the good aspects of the relationship. We have to keep channels of communication, both at the diplomatic level and at the military level, open. But at the same time, I'm afraid my view is that this is an inflection point in India-China relations, and we can discuss further what the Chinese are trying to say and signal. But this is an inflection point, and that India will have to reassess its China policy.
I want to come to how we must do this recalibration, because so many suggestions have come out in the last few weeks. You have put it very bluntly, and I think the Ministry of External Affairs is also now saying that it is squarely putting the blame on China. It is Chinese actions and the aggression they have shown, and of course the fact that India has lost 20 soldiers. We don't yet know how many casualties the Chinese side suffered on June 15th. Is there an easy answer? And I know there isn't, but I'm still going to ask you that question. When people look in surprise at what has happened, particularly the deaths that our army has suffered, and ask, why did China do this? Is this history, geography, economic hegemony? Is it about Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi? Is it just China's pure ambition?
Why the Chinese have done it? There is a tactical reason and there is a strategic reason. The tactical reason is purely to sit on territory which it believes and claims to be its own. Now, why is that wrong? Why is changing the status quo wrong? The answer to that is because there is no agreed boundary between India and China. There is what is called a line of actual control, but even that, it is not an agreed line of actual control. But strategically, what they are trying to indicate and signal is they are the biggest power in Asia. India should understand its place in this pecking order. And this is a constant Chinese refrain and theme throughout its history. My suggestion to the government of India, and I don't know if it will take that suggestion, others have also made it, is that we must ban Chinese firms from participating in our 5G trials and rollout. That is something which will hurt them. It will hurt Huawei and ZTE, and that will send a solid message.
And I do see a lot of social media talking about this idea. There is, however, there are two hitches that I can see straight away, which is why, in a world that is much more interconnected than perhaps it was in
Sure.
1962, I do have to ask. The first thing is obviously the cost of Chinese goods, which is much lower than others, and
Sure.
the idea that people may enjoy may actually like the rhetoric because it calms people at a time when they are very angry. But in actual fact, if you have a choice between, say, an iron or a waffle iron or whatever that is 1,000 rupees, and buying an Indian or an Italian thing that is 2,000 rupees, you may make a different decision. The second place, and I think these are concerns that have been already officially indicated by our Exporters Association, is that they feel very strongly that their exports are going to get stopped reciprocally. As it is, there is this deficit between India and China. If Indian exports are completely stopped, that is going to have an impact on us. We're also hearing about if you like, the casualties on the side in terms of goods that are coming from China, but maybe from other countries that are being stopped now at our ports. Do you think that an economic war of this kind is sustainable over time?
No, look, I am not at all recommending or suggesting that there be an economic war. I am not at all suggesting that there should be some kind of deep freeze between India and China. In fact, I'm recommending that there must be channels of communication between our two countries, diplomatic and military, and other channels of communication. So I'm not saying that we should go back to a policy which was decided post the 1962 conflict. I'm not saying that at all. But at the same time, we should unambiguously indicate through policy changes we make, and there could be pushback from China, and we will have to see how that works, and we can take it. But we have to show that we, as a country, are not going to take things lying down, and we are not going to accede to Chinese hegemony. There will be pain, there will be economic pain. There is no doubt about that. But I think there is no gain without pain.
So some of this pain has been absorbed very easily when it comes to India and Pakistan, and I know that you have served in both countries. Do you think there is a comparison between how India has, over the last few years, completely cut itself off from Pakistan, completely done away with trade ties? There are no real exchanges, cultural exchanges. Visas are at a low, and we really actually don't have any ties except what is absolutely necessary between the two countries. Is that a possibility with China?
No, I don't think so, because the situation of each of those countries is radically different. And with China, let me say that we have communications with the decision makers in China. On the other hand, I think with Pakistan, we don't have interaction and communication with the decision makers in Pakistan, which is basically the Pak army. So the two situations are entirely different. But to come back to your question, I think that we need to send a strong message, and we'll have to take it on the chin, as our soldiers have done on the ground. And India as a country has sent a message on the ground militarily. It needs to be backed up by policy decisions.
All right. In terms of what we know militarily at the LAC, and you've described the situation over there, I do have to ask, and I know that this is perhaps not the best time to ask it, yet we are now 2 months into a standoff. Was India caught napping? Were we taken by surprise? Was the Wuhan summit and the Mahabalipuram summit that followed actually something that dulled our senses into believing that this kind of thing would not have happened?
No, not at all. In fact, I think, we have been tracking very closely what the Chinese military has been doing. We knew that they were in this part of the world on their side for military exercises. What they did was quickly divert those troops to the LAC. And I don't think we were caught.
How do we counter the Chinese strategy of one step backwards and then two steps forward? I think, in effect, the two steps forward and then taking one step back is actually what they're doing, possibly trying to do at the LAC as well.
No, absolutely, Mr. Mudliar. Let me say very clearly that we will not permit them, and should not permit them to take two steps forward, one step back. There is no question of that. And therefore, the bottom line in this particular standoff, the bottom line as far as India is concerned, is restoration of the status quo ante, which means your forces go back to where they were before all this started in mid-April or end April or whatever date it started, and nothing short of that.
Is our foreign policy going in the right direction, looking west, looking east, and looking everywhere? Then is appropriate. Should we in fact be putting our eggs into any one basket?
That's an excellent question, and let me say that you're absolutely right, that some of what has happened, including on the India-China border this summer, is the result of a waning superpower and a rising new power. And there is no doubt about that. However, we cannot write off the United States at all. But to come back to what India should be doing, I think that, foreign policy is an outworking of our own domestic policies. And I think we need to focus laser sharp on what we need to be doing domestically, because that is key to how India will respond to other challenges, whether from China or any other country. And domestically, there is no doubt that over the last 10-year period or over the last 8 or 9 years, there has been a secular decline in our GDP growth rate. We have to pay attention to this. We have to set the economics of India right, and to strengthen our economics, if we have to get the geopolitics right and be able to play a role in international geopolitics.
Almost all of human history, the Indian Ocean has been kind of the fulcrum of the world economy, fulcrum of global geopolitics. And while maybe in the last 150 years, the Atlantic and the Pacific have kind of come up in importance, almost the rest of all of history is about the Indian Ocean.
So, when you're talking about that, and we're talking about the increasing importance of the Indian Ocean going forward, sometimes we forget as to just how much of a maritime power India once upon was. You go back 1,000 years, look at Southeast Asia, the influence that India had was in the Indian Ocean. And again, we're grounded by recent history, where we spend all of our time talking about the British or Pakistan or China and the fights that we are having on land. We sometimes forget that historically India was a maritime power. And a lot of that is there in your book. Do you want to share some thoughts on that? Is it time for us to recapture what was once upon a time in the heyday of India, what our true destiny was, which was to look into the Indian Ocean and look beyond that, look at the countries of the Indian Ocean rim?
You're absolutely right. I mean, if you look at Indian history, we have this we have this very terrestrial view of Indian history, continental view. It's all about invasions coming in from the northwest. That tends to dominate our view of history, and consequently, it also dominates the way we see the geopolitics of the world in terms of our relationship with our land borders with Pakistan and China. Whereas, in fact, if you read Indian history, it's so maritime. And the influence of that is there for all to see. I mean, look through Southeast Asia, for example. There is a country there called Indonesia, which has named itself after us. Its national emblem is the Garuda, Vishnu's Garuda. Its currency is the rupiah. I mean, it's consciously modeled itself as a civilizational nation on India and its influence. The largest Hindu temple is, even today, in Cambodia, the Angkor Wat. Singapore is Singhapura, the Lion City. But that's just not in Southeast Asia. You can go even further east. Korean history, for example, starts with the marriage of a local prince to a princess from Ayodhya. You look at Japan. Its culture has been hugely influenced by Buddhism, of course, but lesser appreciated by Hinduism. The word Shinto, for example, is Hindu or Sindhu. So if you go to a Shinto temple, we very often find a Saraswati or a Ganesha there. So there is enormous influence eastward, post-independence era. We closed ourselves in many, many ways. I mean, whether it's the import substitution approach to the economy, but also our worldview became much more inward looking. And this is sad because in some ways, awkwardly, during the colonial period, actually India had over time become much more linked and had been, in fact, if anything, re-establishing its ancient links with the Indian Ocean world. So there were Indian communities in Malaysia and Singapore. There were Indian communities building up in Africa and so on, areas where in ancient India they had been traveling. But immediately after independence, that sort of British Empire anchor to our to this part of the world broke down, and it broke down in I would say, in an unhappy way.
You know, obviously, when we're talking about the Indian Ocean in the context of the present or the future, it's always going to be in terms of the competition with China. But one of the interesting things is that it's not something which is particularly new. If India retreated from the oceans in the early, like let's say 700 or 800 years ago, it was partly self-imposed because we said, oh, caste, you lose your caste if you go out onto the seas. It was partly because China under Zhang Zhe and others came into the Indian Ocean, almost pushed everyone out. Perhaps opened the doors, as you've written in your book, for the colonialists, but the Indian-Chinese competition is not something which is happening for the first time in this ocean.
You're absolutely right. So India and China as civilizations and the civilization empires that existed at various points in time have competed with each other in multiple ways. And the Indian Ocean has, not surprisingly, and Southeast Asia have been a part of that competition. So I'll give you a flavor of two periods on which this has happened, and you will immediately see how different things were between, say, the Chola period with the 11th century and by the 15th century, how things had completely changed. So just bear with me while I tell you the two stories. So if you went back to the early 11th century, world trade was essentially about trade from Fatimid-ruled Egypt to the Chola Empire, which controlled most of southern India and Sri Lanka, and then through Southeast Asia to Song Empire in China. And this trade eastward used to go through two major straits. One was the Malacca Straits, which is between what is now Malaysia and Sumatra. And the other was the Sunda Strait, which went through Java and Sumatra. Now, typically, the Sunda Straits was controlled by the Javanese, and the Malacca Straits was controlled by the Srivijaya Empire of Sumatra. So that was the balance of power, so to speak. Now, in the very beginning of the 11th century, I think around about 1014 or thereabouts, the Javans began to threaten the Sumatrans. And the Sumatrans signed up with the Song Empire in China for support. And so they got a lot of Chinese support, and they began to push the Javans out. And they were so successful that they suddenly came in control of both the straits. And like any monopolist, what they did is they began to extract rent, i.e. high taxes on trade going between India and China. Now, this is something, not surprisingly, irritated the Cholas, who controlled southern India. And they sent in 1017, they sent a sort of warning fleet to sort of suggest that they shouldn't be doing this, but it didn't work clearly. Because in 1025, at about exactly the same time that Somnath was being sacked, by the way, by Mahmud Ghazni, Rajendra Chola sent this massive fleet from Nagapattinam through the Sunda Straits and then into the Malacca Straits and sacked all the Srivijaya ports. And then the main battle was fought on the mainland in Kadaram, which is modern Kedah in Malaysia. And the Srivijayan Empire army was completely demolished. And then the fleet came back. Now, the Cholas didn't attempt to conquer Southeast Asia. What they did, however, do is they established control enough that these two straits became open and trade was reestablished.
Yeah.
Also interesting is what the Chinese did in response. Now, clearly, the Srivijaya were their allies and vassals. Interestingly, they did nothing. Now, why they did nothing is unclear. but it's quite possible that they were just as irritated by the rent extraction by the Sumatrans. But it is known that a few years later, the Cholas and the Srivijaya sent a joint embassy to the Song court. So clearly, it was something that the Chinese accepted. So this
the first battle in a sense was India won, China 0, if you like to say. That was that entire act.
We don't quite know. It certainly was the case that India did push back Chinese influence. And the Chinese have access to it because it suited their cause as well. We don't know.
But the second one was where the Chinese were able to, India did pull back to the land, and then when Zhangzhou and the treasure fleet and all came, then after that, that really set the stage almost for a colonization of India.
So now I'll tell you about the second story, which is somewhat different. Now the Chola Empire collapsed, and then of course we had the Turkic invasions, which basically tore apart much of southern India, Malik Kafur and so on, destroying the empires there. And you see Indian naval power also kind of shrink as a result of this. Now, by the time you arrive at the beginning of the 15th century, by the way, just to say that just at the time that the Turks were invading India, just a little bit after that, the Mongols did pretty much the same thing to both the Arabs on one side. They sacked Baghdad, and they also sacked and destroyed the Chinese Song Empire. So this entire universe I described in my first part of my talk was completely demolished by Central Asian invaders. But China and the Arabs, but here we're talking about the China, by the early 1400s, they had come back under the Ming. And the Ming began to fund these huge maritime expeditions into the Indian Ocean, led by a very unlikely person, a Muslim eunuch admiral called Zheng He. And he led these huge treasure fleets into the Indian Ocean. And after a while, they were massive. Some of their ships were big by modern standards. And put it in perspective, they were 4 to 5 times the size of Vasco da Gama's ships. So these were huge.
400 feet, I think, was his lead ship, as compared to Christopher Columbus's 85 feet or something.
Yeah, so they were huge. And each of them had something like 20 to 25,000 people in each one of these expeditions. So these are not trivial expeditions. And they turned up in the Indian Ocean, and they began to change kings and move pieces around over a period of time. And they tried, I think, semi-successfully to replace the king of Sri Lanka, for example. If you had been there in 1440, you would have said, this is certainly the next century or more is going to be the Chinese period, because they simply were vastly more powerful than everyone else. But what is interesting is that domestic politics got in the way. So the old emperor died, and a new emperor came to the throne. And the new emperor had the backing of the Confucian bureaucrats, the mandarins. And the mandarins hated the eunuchs who controlled the navy. Now, because they disliked each other, there was a court intrigue, and the bureaucrats did what all bureaucrats would do under the circumstance. They switched off the money. And
from you, that's really interesting. You are, as the principal economic advisor to the government, you know what happens if you start switching off money.
And then, of course, the Navy just died. The Chinese Navy actually rotted in the ports, and their records of these voyages were actually suppressed to such an extent that even the Chinese themselves more or less forgot about it. It was only in the 20th century that we began to rediscover them.
Yeah.
And so there was this massive withdrawal of Chinese power. So the Chinese had come into the Indian Ocean, knocked down everybody else, particularly the Indonesians, who by this time were very powerful. So they knocked down the Indonesians, but also everybody else, the Arabs and everybody else, and then suddenly withdrawn for extraneous reasons. So this is the context in which Vasco da Gama turned up in the Indian Ocean. Now you wonder why the Portuguese, with just a handful of ships, were able to take over the whole Indian Ocean within a few short years. Well, because the Chinese had been there and they had withdrawn.
No, history, I think you're fond of saying that history may not repeat itself, but it rhymes. So some of what is happening right now is rhyming with that. And let's just take one example, the Malacca Straits that you were talking about. Way back, right? Chola dynasty time, what's going to happen to the Malacca Straits and who's going to control it was a major issue. If there is one thing that the Chinese would be scared of today, and the one pain point that India has over China, it is we can plug the Malacca Straits anytime that we really choose to. And that's by, like it's the place where your granduncle was once, I think, imprisoned, the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. India has potentially 5 unsinkable aircraft carriers in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. And I don't know if it's just a coincidence, but once the government had announced a week or 10 days ago that we are going to build up these 5 or 6 potential bases, 2 days later came the news that the Chinese are talking and withdrawing from Galwana. Maybe it's a coincidence, maybe it's not. But it's again an indication that the Indian Ocean is where India's power is potentially the greatest. Your ability to pressurize other people is the greatest. The Andaman and Nicobar Islands in particular, like has happened in the past, if you think again the way what used to happen through history, you say, okay, we will build up the Andaman and Nicobar Islands and these 4 or 5 bases, and we will have China or anybody else under pressure. So that's the way you should learn from history and apply it now.
If you look at the history of the world, every power that has been kind of controlled global economy has at some point or the other attempted to control Malacca Straits, and specifically the town of Malacca, which was the key to it, after which it's named. So I talked, of course, about the Cholas sacking it, but there was also, when the Portuguese turned up, they made a beeline for Malacca and they conquered it. So if you go to Malacca, there is a Portuguese period. And then the Dutch conquered it a little bit from the Portuguese when they were at their height. And then, of course, the British conquered it from the Dutch, and so on and so forth. The point I'm making to you is controlling that strait is not a trivial thing. And in fact, the rise of Singapore is all to do with trying to control one end of it. And why did they do that? Well, because the East India Company was exporting opium from India to China, so they had to go through the strait. So Singapore is the result of trying to control the strait. Now, that's one end of the Malacca Strait. The other end of the Malacca Strait, of course, is the Andaman Islands. So we are sitting on the other side. We are sitting on this sort of the counterpoint to Singapore in the Andamans. And of course, there is another choking point in the Indian Ocean, which is on the other side, which is with Aden. And of course, there, the Chinese already have a base in Djibouti. So there is a history, a long history to that as well.
There are other countries which you don't traditionally think of Indian Ocean powers, but I'm glad that India has now started to talk to them and the possibility of using their bases, such as France. I mean, Reunion. Nobody thinks of France as the Indian Ocean power, but they do have Reunion. They have other places which can be. So at least that thinking, I suspect, is starting, and it's somewhat overdue.
You know, it's something that we should have done right from the beginning. But for a variety of reasons, we had this very terrestrial view of the world, land-based view of the world. I'm very pleased that we have begun to have a much more maritime view, and it will allow us to begin to do very interesting things. We have to also be very careful not to overplay this ancient linkages, and I'll tell you why. To the extent we do recognize it, i.e., when suddenly somebody just suddenly discovers that there is an Indian link, we tend to sort of present it as if India handed over civilization to many of these places in Southeast Asia and so on. This is unfortunately the flip side. Either we ignore it, but the few who do look at it kind of see ourselves as sort of giver of civilization. That's also not a good idea, because much of this Indian Ocean civilization is a shared civilization. Many things we consider to be Indian are actually imports from these countries. I'll give you one example. Eating pan. Both the pan leaf and the supari are actually imports from Southeast Asia. And we have naturalized it here. So this is a shared civilization. We have to be very careful, while we do play a very central role in it, not to overplay it in order to be overbearing about our role in this whole ecosystem.
How important is the Indian Ocean for China's string of pearls strategy, and how is it a threat to India? Well, we've been also talking about an Indian string of pearls that will make China's life difficult. But yes, people talk more about the Chinese string. Obviously, the Chinese string of pearls are a threat to India. But India does have advantages. Let's not forget, you've heard us talking about the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. You have Australia as an ally, France as an ally, Maldives, Seychelles. You could actually put bases all across the Indian Oceans, or places of Indian influence all across the Indian Ocean, which makes it virtually impossible for the Chinese or anybody else to traverse. Not just the Malacca Strait. If you've got the Sunda Strait, if you've got Indonesia as an ally, Australia as an ally, you can have something on the Coco Islands. It's very easily doable to really give China a headache, and a headache such that they will find it very difficult to come into the Indian Ocean. So do you think the Indian Ocean region is the emergent power in world affairs today, and how should India build on past relations for the future? Well, I think that's what we almost spent 45 minutes talking. So Indian Ocean as an emergent power, or just to add to that, before I throw it to you, is it going to be Indo-Pacific, which seems to be the flavor of the season?
Yes, I mean, the game today is the Pacific. In the 19th century and the early 20th century, it was the Atlantic. But there will be a transition, even if it does come into the Indian Ocean area. There is no doubt that the Pacific will, for the time being, be the more important and dominant relationship between China and the US. But the very fact that the Indo-Pacific has been added into it tells you the way this ecosystem of economics and geopolitics is spilling over to us. Now, nothing in history is inevitable. To some extent, it is for us in India to make it happen. Our importance of the Indian Ocean is dependent, at least part, on what India does and how we respond to the opportunities that we have. So it is one thing I will say is that we need to go out and embrace this. We cannot do what we did after the decline of the Cholas, which is to look inward. That is not an option. It did not help us in the 13th century. It's not going to help us now.
Even if it's not about something that's written down, it could be about a system or even a technology that's put in place at this time, which could subsequently be misused. And I'm thinking, for example, of Netanyahu's response, of this creation of an additional layer of surveillance in what is already a very highly observed society.
Right now is a really good time to have a conversation about how this kind of technology can be used. Is there a way to put it in place temporarily? Can you put time limits on it? Can you agree to have your phone tracked by, the sanitary officials, by the officials controlling the epidemic for 6 months, but with the guarantee that all the information disappears after a year. I mean, I have to tell you, I'm in Poland now. We came back here from, I had been in Britain. I came back here when I saw that the borders were going to close. And we had a 2-week quarantine here where we had to stay at home. And the police actually came to our house every day to check and make sure we were here. And that's the sort of 19th century version of these apps.
If you want to sort of make that point in some societies, then you would be perhaps accused of, it seems odd to say to be on the side of the disease, but there would be some kind of sort of rhetorical delegitimization of that question. So do you have a sense of what these rhetorical tactics are? Are some of them already being used by some of them?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this has already been used by the Prime Minister of Hungary. He said that people who oppose his laws, are pro-virus, and he accused foreign critics of his laws of being, getting in the way of the Hungarian government, which is trying to stop a disease. In other words, you've begun to hear in a few places that any criticism of the regime or of the democratically elected leaders can be interpreted as, you just want to spread disease. And that can be, we should watch out for this, because that can be a very useful way of polarizing people, of somehow packaging this fear that people fear, this anxiety, and projecting it somewhere. I mean, this is I'm sure, this is another way in which fear is going to be used, particularly, I think, governments that have trouble controlling this, and in places where, the healthcare system isn't functional, and in places where, the healthcare system isn't functional, or where, people become very panicked. you will see an attempt to, to blame somebody, whether it's blaming foreigners, whether it's blaming, I don't know, the European Union, whether it's blaming minorities inside your own country. This is going to be another tactic that people will use when there's a lot of fear and anxiety. The rulers don't want it directed at them, and so they're going to try and ensure that it's directed at somebody else, whether or not they have people who have anything to do with it. Over the next weeks and months, we'll see trouble in some autocratic states, the ones that have been bluffing, and we'll see some success in some democratic states as well. So, it's going to be, it's almost like the rules have shifted. People who were good at creating these fake conflicts and polarizing society and creating, lots of anger and hatred, they were doing pretty well, a year ago. Right now, actually, there's a premium that's going to be placed on people who are actually good at governing.
Part of the reason why we have why we're sort of focused on that particular competition between these two narratives is because the competition such as it was between the US and China seemed to have, as you said, the US response has been so confused. But more than that, it seems to me that you could say it has been counterproductive in the sense that early stories existed that the Trump administration wanted to perhaps buy entire companies in Germany, for example, that might have a chance at producing a vaccine quicker, and in order to ensure that vaccine was reserved for US use. And isn't that really not the kind of thing one would expect from, leader of the free world kind of country?
Look, this is an administration that, they took office saying they were nationalists, that they didn't believe in international organizations and institutions, that they, America first and all that. And it's been, they've pursued that in a very strange way. A lot of the time it seems not so much America first, but Trump and his family first. Not everything that the president has done has seemed designed to benefit Americans. It seems more designed to benefit. It's almost like his political choices are designed to benefit him. But they have effectively, they've undermined their relationships, America's relationships with its closest allies. Europeans have kind of given up on the United States. They've undermined relationships with others around the world. And in this crisis, we see the effect of it. As a friend of mine, a sort of former European prime minister, actually said to me a couple of days ago, it's not just that the U.S. is failing. We've had U.S. failure before. We've had the Americans try to organize things, and it doesn't work. In this crisis, there's not even a hint that the Americans are trying to do anything. Like there's no G7, there's no G20, there's no, the U.S. isn't standing together with the WHO. There are a lot of problems with the WHO, but there's no U.S. effort to fix the WHO.
The balance of power between the public and the private sector, since presumably any real solutions will come now from the private sector. Do you think that balance is being shifting yet again?
This will play out differently in different countries. In the United States, meant that there was this big role for private business. That's true, and it's true that that I suspect. I think the medical innovation will come from the private sector. Quite a lot of many the diagnostics and so on that will come from the private sector, and there's like a huge role for the private sector, particularly the medical biotech industry, to play here. The question is though, some of the decisions that have to be taken and some of the measures that have to be taken, it's just not possible for the private sector to do it. Social distancing, isolation, quarantine, contact tracing, all those, all the kind of non-medical approaches to the pandemic, all the behavioral approaches, that all requires, bureaucratic or government intervention. This is another reason why democracies have some advantage over dictatorships in this, because transparency is one of the ways in which we can fight this thing. The more we know about it, the more we know how many people really have it, how many people died from it, the more testing we can do, the more sense we have of its scale and how it's really affecting the population, the more intelligent our decisions will be, the more intelligent we can be about lockdowns. And so, given how hapless and how uncoordinated the American reaction has been, and how little the Trump administration has been involved in any international conversation about this. I mean, there is a way in which the Chinese are clearly trying to take advantage of that and are setting themselves up as, the power that can instruct and help the world. I mean, as you know, I mean, the trouble with that narrative is that we all also know that this virus came from China. And we also know that however successfully they claim to have controlled it inside their country, they did not stop it from spreading. They did not prevent planes from leaving Wuhan. They did not, they didn't stop it from getting out to the rest of the world.
Thank you, Gautam Bambavle, Suhasini Haidar, Sanjeev Sanyal, Vikram Chandra, Anne Applebaum, and Mihir S. Sharma for that fabulous session. That truly was incredible and really puts out the perspective on the present day crisis across the world, be it geopolitics or be it COVID. Thank you all for watching and being such a great audience. Remember, this weekend, please join us at the JLF London, the British Library, from the 11th to 13th of September. To check out our fantastic program on our websites, jlflitfest.org, and join in. And remember, you must log in and register on jlflitfest.org to be part of these sessions. Please do remember to log in at 8:30 p.m. for our GLF Brave New World Season 1 Redux Life Under Lockdown, Alain de Botton in conversation with Anandita Ghosh. Alain de Botton is a Swiss-British writer and philosopher whose essays and love has sold more than 2 million copies. In conversation with Anandita Ghosh, he talks about his life and work and his thoughts on living under lockdown. And now, I'm very delighted to share with you a piece of wonderful literary work by the French author Pierre Gautin. Since its release on September 9, 1970, Eden, Eden, Eden has provoked scandal, fascination, and admiration. 50 years later, the work of Pierre Gautin, who passed away on February 17th of this year, exerts an ever-growing impact, and Eden, Eden, Eden has proved to be prescient of a world on the verge of transformation through violence, sexuality, decolonization, and cosmology. The end point of colonial history, as well as the starting point of a new history for language, history for the past and the future. With Eden, 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 Gautin engages us in a questioning of history as much as in a haunting vision that aims to bear witness and to heal. Eden, Eden, Eden casts before our eyes the oppression, the possession of bodies as it exists in the present. In order to celebrate this work on its anniversary, September 9th, the Association for Gautin's Friends have organized 50 readings in 50 venues across the world and in France. The book office of the French Institute in India collaborated with Niranjani Iyer, artist, dancer, choreographer, and director of the Pocket Company, to share her voice, body, and emotions in reading an abstract of Eden in Hindi, French, and English. I'd like to thank the French Institute in India, Christine Cornett and her book office team, and of course, Niranjani Iyer and Monica Singh for the translation in Hindi. Ladies and gentlemen, Eden, Eden, Eden. Enjoy.
Les soldats, casqués, jambes ouvertes, foule, muscles retenus, les nouveaux-nés emmaillotés dans les châles écarlates, violets. तोप की बौछारों से छलनी ट्रक की लोहे की चादरों पर दुबक कर बैठी स्त्रियों की बाहों से झांकते शिशु लुढ़क रहे हैं.
Driver's free hand pushing back goat thrown forward into cab.
Au col Le Fercous,
Une platoon crossing
traverse la piste.
Soldiers
Les
jumping
soldats
out of
sautent
trucks.
hors des camions.
Remus Ford lying down on gravel,
छलनी
heads
टायर पर टिकाए मडगार्ड की आड़ में अपने बदन की ऊपरी वस्त्र उतारते हैं। corps ombragé par le garde-boue. स्त्रियां les femmes से बच्चों को चिपकाए उन्हें
Rocking
हिलाते हुए
movements
थपड़ियों
during
को
sex
दबाते हैं,
sharpened with
par la
bonfire
sueur
sweat
की ये हरकत
impregnating
आग
rags,
की खुशबू को भड़काती है, जिसमें उनके
oil,
बड़े प्राण
cloves,
कहते,
henna,
उनका रोम
butter,
उनका बदन
indigo,
का नीचे
black
तरफ
antimony,
beurre, indigo, मेहंदी, मक्खन, मील, सुरमा।
Au bas
की
du
तराई
focus,
में
sous les
पहाड़ी
branches
शब्दों
de
के
cèdre
तहत जली
calciné,
लकड़ियों,
beehives,
जौ,
tombstones,
गेहूं से लड़े,
soda straw,
मधुवाटिका,
school,
कब्रिस्तान,
gadoos,
विद्यालय,
fig trees,
अंजीर के वृक्ष,
nectars, stone
पत्थर
walls
की नीची
oozing with
दीवारें,
spattered brains,
बागीचे,
orchards in
बेसों,
blossom,
आग में
palm
जलकर
trees
तबाह हो
fallen
गए,
in fire, exploding,
fleurs, pollen, épis,
flowers,
brins,
grasses,
papier,
pollen,
étoffes maculées de lait, de
rags
merde, de
spotted
sang,
with milk,
écorces,
shit, with
plumes,
blood,
soulevées,
fruit peel, feathers
ondules,
lifted, shaken,
rejetées de
tossed from
brasier
flame
à
to
brasier par le
flame,
vent qui
in
s'arrache
wind
le feu,
pulling
हवा
up
से
fire
जलती
from
से आग
earth.
खींचती है। Les soldats assoupis se redressent,
ऊँघते
unis
सैनिक
les pans de
उठ
la
खड़े
vache,
होते हैं,
appuient leurs joues
तिरपाल की
marquées de
पैदन की
pleurs
गंध
séchées
महसूस
contre les
करते हैं।
ridelles surchauffées,
Tails,
taqtiयों
rubbing
पर sexe
members
को
against
poussés,
dusty tires,
जिन पर पड़े आंसुओं
sucking
के
in
निशान
sheets,
सूख चुके
drooling
हैं।
over painted wood.
अपने
Truck
लिंग
squad
को
drown
धूल
in
से
dry
सने टायरों के
riverbed,
साथ
cutting
रगड़ते हैं।
oleanders, milk from stalks mixing
गाल
on knife
सटकाए,
blades with
रंग
blood of
की हुई
utes,
लकड़ी पर लाड
disemboweled in
टपकाते
onyx
हैं।
quarry against central vein.
Les soldats taillent, arrachent les plants, les déracinent avec leurs souliers cloutés. सैनिक पौधों को काटते हैं, उखाड़ते हैं, अपने कील लगे जूतों से उनकी जड़ों
Soldier,
को औंधते
chest
हैं।
crushing baby sucking at
बाकी
breast,
सब
parting woman's hair pushed
डोलते
over
झूलते,
eyes,
ठोकर मारते
stroking
चल रहे
forehead
हैं,
with fingers
होठों पे
covered
गोबर,
in powdered
ग्रेनेड,
onyx,
caresse
caressed
le
the
front
front
de
of
la
the
femme
femme
avec
avec
ses doigts poudrés de poussière d'onyx.
dousing baby's buttered scalp.
L'orgasme fait jaillir de sa
Resting,
bouche un jet de
softening on
salive qui
shawls,
mouille le crâne
soaking up
beurré du
dye.
bébé.
Wind
Le sexe
shaking trucks,
ressorti repose en
sand whipping
s'amollissant sur les
against
châles
axles,
dont il prend
sheet
la
metal.
teinture. Le vent
जिन्हें
ébranle
स्त्रियों ने
les
अपनी
camions,
जांघों के
le sable
कंदरा में
fouette les
कसकर
issues,
जकड़
les
रखा
tôles.
है। सैनिक
Les
अपनी
soldats
छाती
s'engouffrent dans
से
les
स्तन से
camions.
चिपके बच्चे को मसलते हुए स्त्री के बाल हटाता है
Eyes
जिन्हें उसने
shining
अपनी
in
आंखों
darkening
पर फैला
shadows,
रखा है।
fingers
वह अपनी
glimmering on
गोमेद
belt
से
buckles.
सनी उंगलियों से
Goats,
स्त्री के
coats
माथे को
drenched
फैलाता
with
है।
sweat from pursuit around bonfires, crouching down, licking rags tied
Les
around
chèvres,
thighs of women.
poils mouillés de sueur, dans la
Silent
capture
youth,
कामोन्माद
courante des
उसके
brasiers,
मुंह से लार
Stepping
की
back
ढीस
against
ये
drivers'
लग पड़ी
feet,
है
lambeaux
जिससे
hissing
शिशु
into
तेल
the
चुपड़ी
enamel
खोपड़ी
mark
भीग
and
गई।
mutilated hand. Youth
हवा
kissing
से
palm,
ट्रक
wrist
खड़खड़ा रहे हैं।
rippled with
रेत
veins,
में
le
ट्रक
chauffeur
के
swelling
पहिए और
with
धौंसी
alcoholic
नहाए।
Il
blood.
caresse son front marqué d'une croix bleue. L'adolescent baise la paume, le poignet où les veines saillent bondées de sang alcoolisé. Les chenilles des half-tracks broient les pierres projetées
घोर
sur la
अंधेरे
piste
में
par le vent.
उनकी आंखें जगमगा रही हैं। कमरबंद के बकलस पर उनकी उंगलियां चमक रही हैं। बकरियां कैद में पसीने से लथपथ उकड़ून बैठी स्त्रियों के जांघों पर बंधी कतरनों को चाट रही हैं।
With hobnail boots, driver, black spittle
La tête
drying on
tannée,
chin,
rubescente
crushing,
sous le
pulling
poil
immaculate
blanc
locks from
d'un
occiput
vieillard,
against
tressaute
sheet metal
sur la
beaten
tôle.
from
Sous
below
le levier des
by
vitesses,
cracked stones
मुड़कर
thrown
Du talon
up.
clouté, le chauffeur, salive noire
इस पर
séchant
नीले
au
क्रॉस का
menton,
निशान।
écrase, tire les mèches
किशोर
immaculées de
हथेली को
l'occiput.
चूमता है। कल्हाई जहाँ पर
Females hanging
नसें
up
उभरी
babies' rags
दिख
on
रही हैं।
bushes.
मादक
Au
रक्त
camp,
से लबालब
Le
भरी
soldat,
हुई।
chien,
Slug
la
Sainik
nuit
rotting
ung
meat,
रहे हैं।
vomit,
les
glimmering
femelles
rosy,
accrochent au
under
buisson
lifeless
les
leaves
haillons des
bending.
nouveau-nés.
Soldiers pushing back, with
ट्रक
butts of
जिसमें
rifles,
पुरुष
women
पशु
laying babies
गतरियों
down
का
in
ढेर
tents,
लड़ा है।
kicking
La
the
boue des
wounded
déchets de
haunches of
viande,
males,
de vomissures,
bent over
scintille,
unrolled
rosée,
tarpaulins.
sous les arcs des roseaux atones.
Remus Cord pushing into den hollowed out on the
सूजन
platform of
आंख के
camp
नीचे
in
है।
vein of onyx.
उसकी जेबें काले अंगूर से ठूसी हुई हैं। बूढ़ा धूप से झुलसा चेहरा सफेद रोओं के तह में लाल
Ce Durina
झटके से
s'engouffre dans le
तीन
foyer
पे
creusé
खड़कता
sous
है।
la plateforme du camp
Accélérateur
dans
के
un
नीचे।
gisement d'onyx.
Beer, wine, cut with bromide, splashing over shoulders, bare breasts of waiter.
Les éclats de verre
Remus
retombés
Cord
dans la
rolling,
rotonde
vomiting
obscurcie
in corners.
criblent, paillettes,
Waiter,
chaussures,
greasy
exprès
shorts
sourcils
slipping
ballottés,
down
bottes
loins
rares,
barefoot.
है।
tattooed on ankle with women's
खेमी में
breast,
सैनिक
trampling
कुत्ते
on
मेरी
floor
टीम
cloth,
साफ करो
edging around counter,
औरतें
pushing
नवजातों के
cloth along
चीथड़े झाड़ियों पर
vomiting
टांग रही
soldiers.
हैं
Vomissent aux ongles.
पुरुष
Le
कूड़े
serveur,
के
son
ढेरों के
short
किनारे
enduit de
तंबू खड़े
graisse
कर रहे
glissant
हैं
sur ses reins,
मांस
foule de sang
वामन के
pieds
कचड़े
nus,
का कीचड़
tatoué sur la
सरकंडे की
cheville d'un
तरानों
sein
के
de
तले
femme, hunting,
une serpillère
foreheads covered with dust, heads leaning lifeless on shoulders, eyes violet-hued, watching erection of tents.
Les enfants, cul bourrés de crottes embouclées, assis sur l'herbe rongée par le sel, वे पैर से ठोकर
Alerte.
मार रहे हैं,
Le
मुक्के
front
मार रहे
couvert de
हैं,
poussière,
लपेटे
la
तिरपाल
tête
के नीचे
inclinée
पुरुषों की
atone
झुकी
sur
कमर
l'épaule, l'œil violacé, scrutant
नौसेना
rubbing
के
breasts
सिपाही
under
बसेरों में
armpits.
समा रहे हैं जो ऊंची
Girls'
समतल
eyes
भूमि के
closing,
नीचे गोमेद
head
की
touching
खदान में
soldier's wrist,
खोदकर
smeared
तंबू
with
में
grape
बनाई गई
juice.
है। उत्तेजित चेहरे लड़खड़ाते हुए दीवारों पर बोतलें फेंक रही
Gust of wind lifting
Palpe
up
les seins,
over
les
man's
aisselles.
excrement.
La
Pages
fillette
of
ferme ses
comics
yeux,
torn out by
sa
hands
tête
of
attouche
soldiers
le poignet
crouched
enduit
over
de jus de
ditches,
raisin du soldat.
tents, forcing out
Une
burning
salive
shit
grise
after
de faim
forays of
coule
rain.
hors de sa bouche sur sa joue, mouille le poing du soldat. Un coup de vent soulève dessous les tas excrémentiels, les pages de romans films déchirées aux mains des soldats accroupis sur les fosses, expulsant, crispés, la merde ardente des retours de
Lieutenant
viol.
crouching naked in tub of lukewarm
एक स्त्री का
water,
स्तन
streaked
रौंद
with
देता है
rays filtered through
काउंटर के
lattice,
गिर्द घूमकर
whistling,
वह उसे वामन
medallion
करते सैनिकों
balanced
के
on
मुंह
tip of
तक
tongue.
धकेल देता है। दो पुरुष तंबू के पीछे अपने जानवरों को बांध रहे हैं, बच्चे शार से नष्ट घास पर बैठे हाँफ रहे हैं।
Glands violacés attouchant la mousse rosée par le raisin, paix baignant le rebord de bronze du baquet, prowling around forçant le sifflement, untying thongs,
des soldats
triqueurs du même bal métropolitain, au feu déclinant, errent autour des tentes, ils dénouent les lanières, ils rampent sur le sable.